Ambassador Elena Vasquez had negotiated trade agreements with crystalline entities who communicated through harmonic resonance, gas giant dwellers who thought in terms of millennium-long cycles, and machine intelligences that processed information faster than human consciousness could follow. But she'd never encountered a diplomatic challenge quite like Queen Zara Keth of the Zarathi Empire, whose presence seemed to reorganize the very atmosphere of negotiation rooms in ways that had nothing to do with political authority and everything to do with something Elena couldn't quite name. The Zarathi were known throughout the galaxy for their emphasis on aesthetic perfection, their architecture flowed like crystallized music, their technology resembled living art, and their society revolved around the pursuit of beauty in all its forms. Elena had prepared for negotiations by studying their cultural values, their trade requirements, and their diplomatic protocols, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of Queen Zara herself. Ambassador Vasquez, Queen Zara said, her voice carrying musical undertones that seemed to resonate in frequencies Elena could feel rather than simply hear, "Welcome to Zirian Prime. I trust your journey was comfortable." "Very comfortable, Your Majesty," Elena replied, trying to maintain diplomatic focus while processing the unexpected complexity of her first impression of the Zarathi ruler. Queen Zara was tall even by Zarathi standards, her form graceful in ways that suggested someone who moved with unconscious elegance despite what Elena was beginning to recognize as deliberate attempts to minimize her own presence. Her scales reflected light in subtle patterns that created depth and movement across her skin, and her eyes held the kind of intelligence that made conversations feel like explorations rather than exchanges. "Please, be seated," Queen Zara said, gesturing toward the negotiation chamber's discussion area with movements that displayed an inherent grace that Elena found remarkably appealing. As they settled into the preliminary discussions about trade frameworks and mutual interests, Elena found herself struggling to maintain the professional detachment that effective diplomacy required. Queen Zara's voice carried nuances that made even routine diplomatic language sound like poetry. Her gestures displayed an unconscious artistry that transformed simple communication into something approaching performance, and her presence created an atmosphere of focused attention that made everything else seem temporarily irrelevant. "Your Majesty," Elena said during a pause in their trade discussions, "I want to express my appreciation for the hospitality you've shown our delegation. The accommodations have been exceptional." "You are most welcome," Queen Zara replied, though something in her tone suggested that compliments made her uncomfortable rather than pleased. "Ambassador, shall we discuss the specific commodities that might benefit both our civilizations?" Elena noted the subtle deflection away from personal acknowledgement and decided to focus on the professional aspects of their interaction while trying to understand the cultural dynamics that seemed to influence Queen Zara's responses to positive attention. "Our preliminary analysis suggests that human agricultural techniques could enhance Zarathi food production efficiency, while Zarathi biotechnology could revolutionize human medical capabilities," Elena said, activating holographic displays that showed potential areas of cooperation. "An intriguing possibility," Queen Zara said, studying the data with the focused attention that Elena was learning to recognize as characteristic of her approach to complex problems. "However, cultural integration of new technologies requires careful consideration of compatibility factors." Meaning that successful cooperation between our species will depend on our ability to understand each other's values and priorities, Queen Zara explained, her scales shifting color in response to her emotional state in ways that Elena found fascinating despite her lack of expertise in Zarathi nonverbal communication. "I couldn't agree more," Elena said, recognizing an opportunity to explore the cultural dimensions that would affect their negotiations. "Your Majesty, what aspects of human culture do you find most compatible with Zarathi values?" Queen Zara considered the question with the thoroughness that Elena was beginning to appreciate as fundamental to her decision-making process. "Human adaptability impresses me," she said finally. "Your species seems capable of finding value and beauty in unexpected places, regardless of conventional standards or traditional limitations." "That's an interesting observation," Elena said, noting the way Queen Zara's voice carried undertones of something that might have been wistfulness. "Do you find human aesthetic perspectives different from Zarathi approaches to beauty?" "Quite different," Queen Zara confirmed, her scales shifting to patterns that Elena couldn't interpret but found visually striking. "Zarathi beauty standards are precise. Specific. They reward particular forms of luminescence, symmetry, and chromatic harmony that create measurable aesthetic impact. And human beauty standards. See more. Flexible, Queen Zara said carefully, as if discussing concepts that were personally significant but difficult to articulate. From my observations, humans appear to find beauty in diversity, in unexpected combinations, in qualities that transcend simple visual assessment. Elena felt a growing sense that their conversation was touching on issues that extended beyond diplomatic courtesy into territory that was more personal and potentially more meaningful than trade negotiations typically required. Your Majesty, do you find human perspectives on aesthetics appealing? Queen Zara was quiet for a moment, her scales cycling through colors that suggested complex emotional processing. I find human perspectives liberating in theory, she said quietly. Though personally irrelevant in practice. Personally irrelevant? Ambassador Vasquez, Queen Zara said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating obvious realities, Zarathi aesthetic standards are not subjective preferences, they are measurable criteria that determine social status, mating opportunities, and even political advancement. By those standards, I am inadequate. Elena felt her chest tighten as she realized that Queen Zara was describing not just cultural information but personal experience of exclusion based on appearance. Your Majesty, surely your position as ruler indicates that aesthetic considerations are less important than other qualifications. My position as ruler exists because traditional succession was suspended in favor of merit-based selection during a political crisis, Queen Zara explained with clinical precision. I became queen not despite my appearance, but because my appearance eliminated me from conventional political alliances and forced me to develop alternative capabilities. Alternative capabilities. Intelligence, strategic thinking, diplomatic skill, and the ability to make decisions based on rational analysis rather than emotional attachment, Queen Zara said, her voice carrying the weight of someone whose entire life had been shaped by the need to compensate for perceived inadequacies. Elena studied Queen Zara's face, noting the sharp intelligence in her eyes, the thoughtful way she approached complex problems, and the unconscious grace with which she moved through their conversation. From Elena's perspective, Queen Zara was remarkably appealing, her voice was captivating, her presence commanded attention, and her mind displayed the kind of sophisticated thinking that Elena found intellectually attractive. Your Majesty, Elena said carefully, from a human perspective, intelligence and grace are considered highly attractive qualities. From a human perspective, perhaps, Queen Zara agreed with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. But perspectives vary significantly between species, and attraction is typically species-specific. Not always, Elena said, recognizing that their conversation had moved beyond diplomatic territory into something more personal and potentially more significant. Queen Zara's scales shifted to patterns that Elena was beginning to associate with surprise mixed with something that might have been hope. Ambassador, are you suggesting that human aesthetic preferences might include appreciation for Zarathi individuals who don't meet traditional Zarathi beauty standards? I'm suggesting that beauty is more complex and individual than any single culture's standards can capture, Elena replied, meeting Queen Zara's eyes with the honesty that seemed appropriate for addressing misconceptions that had clearly caused significant personal pain. An intriguing hypothesis, Queen Zara said, her voice carrying new undertones that suggested Elena's words had challenged assumptions that the Queen had never thought to question. Your Majesty, would you be willing to test that hypothesis? What kind of test did you have in mind? Elena realized that she was about to either enhance their diplomatic relationship by demonstrating genuine appreciation for Queen Zara's remarkable qualities, or complicate it by revealing personal attraction that might violate professional boundaries. I'd like to spend more time learning about Zarathi culture directly from you, Elena said, choosing words that could serve diplomatic purposes while allowing for personal connection. Not just for negotiation purposes, but because I find your perspective fascinating and your company quite appealing. Queen Zara's scales cycled through colors that Elena couldn't interpret, but her expression showed the kind of careful consideration that suggested Elena's words had created possibilities that required serious evaluation. Ambassador Vasquez, Queen Zara said slowly, are you certain that your interest in my company is professional rather than diplomatic courtesy. I'm certain that my interest in your company extends beyond professional necessity, Elena replied honestly. Your Majesty, you're one of the most intellectually engaging people I've encountered, and I find myself wanting to understand not just your political positions but your thoughts on beauty, culture, and the ways that different perspectives can challenge our assumptions about what matters most. Queen Zara was quiet for a long moment, her scales shifting through patterns that seemed to indicate internal debate about possibilities she'd never seriously considered. Very well, Ambassador, she said finally. Let us explore whether human and Zarathi perspectives on beauty and attraction are as different as conventional wisdom suggests. Elena felt a spark of anticipation as she realized that their negotiations had evolved beyond trade agreements into something far more personally significant for both of them. Over the following days, Elena's official schedule included formal trade negotiations, cultural briefings, and diplomatic receptions, but her most meaningful interactions with Queen Zara occurred during the informal moments between official functions. Conversations that revealed the depth of insecurity that Zarathi beauty standards had created in someone whose intelligence and capabilities far exceeded conventional measures of worth. Ambassador, Queen Zara said during one of their private discussions in the palace gardens, I've been considering your observations about human perspectives on beauty and attraction. May I ask what specific qualities humans find appealing in potential partners? Elena studied Queen Zara's posture, noting how the queen consistently positioned herself to minimize others' view of her profile and how she spoke with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being valued for intellect rather than appearance. Human attraction is remarkably individual, Elena said, settling onto a garden bench beside Queen Zara while maintaining respectful distance. Some humans are drawn to physical symmetry, others to emotional intelligence, still others to shared interests or complementary personalities. There's no universal standard. But surely there are general preferences that most humans share. Some statistical trends exist, Elena acknowledged, but personal attraction often defies statistical analysis. I've known humans who were attracted to partners whose appearance other humans found unremarkable, and others who formed deep attachments based entirely on intellectual connection or emotional compatibility. Queen Zara's scales shifted to the deep blues that Elena was learning indicated thoughtful processing. In Zarathi culture, attraction follows predictable patterns based on luminescence quality, chromatic harmony, and structural proportion. Individual variation exists, but within narrow parameters. And where do you fall within those parameters? Elena asked gently. Outside them entirely, Queen Zara said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating established facts. My scales lack the luminescent quality that indicates genetic fitness. My proportions are asymmetrical by Zarathi standards. My coloring is considered plain. Elena looked at Queen Zara's scales, noting how they reflected garden light in subtle patterns that created depth and movement across her skin, how her asymmetrical features created a unique harmony that was far more interesting than perfect symmetry would have been, and how her so-called plain coloring actually displayed remarkable complexity when observed with attention. Your Majesty, from my perspective, your appearance is anything but plain. Ambassador, I appreciate diplomatic courtesy, but accurate assessment benefits us both more than flattery. This isn't flattery, Elena said firmly. Your scales create light patterns that change based on your movement and emotional state, that's far more visually engaging than static luminescence could be. Your asymmetrical features create a kind of dynamic harmony that draws attention because it's unexpected and sophisticated. And your coloring has subtle variations that become more apparent the longer someone looks. Queen Zara turned to study Elena's face with the analytical attention she applied to complex political problems. You're describing qualities that Zarathi aesthetic theory considers imperfections. I'm describing qualities that human aesthetic appreciation recognizes as distinctive and appealing, Elena corrected. Your Majesty, beauty isn't objective, it's a complex interaction between observer and observed that varies based on cultural background, personal experience, and individual preferences. But if beauty is subjective, how do we account for widespread cultural consensus about aesthetic standards? Cultural consensus creates shared frameworks for evaluation, but it doesn't eliminate individual variation, Elena explained. Just because most Zarathi find certain qualities appealing doesn't mean those are the only qualities that can be appealing to anyone. Queen Zara was quiet for several minutes, her scales cycling through colors that suggested she was processing concepts that challenged fundamental assumptions about her own worth and appeal. Ambassador, she said finally, are you suggesting that someone from outside Zarathi culture might find me attractive? I'm suggesting that someone already has, Elena said quietly, recognizing that their conversation had reached a point where honesty would serve both truth and diplomacy better than continued deflection. Queen Zara's scales shifted to brilliant golds and oranges that Elena had never seen before. Colors that seemed to indicate surprise so profound it bordered on shock. You're referring to yourself, Queen Zara said, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone confirming information that seemed too significant to accept without verification. I'm referring to myself, Elena confirmed. Your Majesty, I find you remarkably attractive, intellectually, aesthetically, and personally. Your voice is captivating, your presence commands attention, and your mind displays the kind of sophisticated thinking that I find deeply appealing. But you barely know me beyond our diplomatic interactions. I know that you approach complex problems with thoughtful analysis, that you speak with quiet authority that suggests confidence in your capabilities, that you move with unconscious grace, and that you're concerned enough about accuracy and honesty to question compliments rather than simply accepting them, Elena said. Those are substantial foundations for attraction. Queen Zara stood and moved to the garden's central fountain, her movements displaying the elegant precision that Elena had been admiring since their first meeting. Ambassador, even if your assessment is genuine rather than diplomatic courtesy, attraction between individuals from different species presents complications. What kind of complications? Cultural compatibility, biological differences, political implications, and the practical challenges of maintaining relationships across species barriers, Queen Zara listed with the systematic approach she applied to all complex issues. All valid considerations, Elena agreed, rising to join Queen Zara beside the fountain. But complications aren't necessarily prohibitive factors, they're variables that require careful consideration and creative solutions. You speak as if you've given serious thought to the possibility of interspecies relationships. I've given serious thought to the possibility of a relationship with you specifically, Elena said, recognizing that their conversation had moved beyond theoretical discussion into territory that would require both courage and honesty. Queen Zara's scales cycled through patterns that seemed to indicate internal conflict between hope and disbelief. Ambassador, I need to understand whether your interest in me is based on genuine attraction or on diplomatic strategy designed to enhance our trade negotiations. Your Majesty, if I wanted to use personal relationships to enhance trade negotiations, I would have begun with someone whose culture already considered them attractive, Elena pointed out. Pursuing someone who believes herself to be aesthetically inadequate would be remarkably poor strategy for diplomatic manipulation. Unless you calculated that my experience of social rejection would make me more susceptible to attention from someone whose approval I might value. Elena felt a chill as she realized that Queen Zara's years of cultural rejection had created defensive mechanisms that made trusting positive attention nearly impossible. Your Majesty, that level of calculated manipulation would require me to view you as a target rather than as a person whose company I genuinely enjoy. And which am I? You're someone whose intelligence I respect, whose perspective I find fascinating, and whose presence makes diplomatic functions feel like conversations with a friend rather than professional obligations, Elena said honestly. Your Majesty, I'm attracted to you because of who you are, not because of what that attraction might accomplish. Queen Zara turned to face Elena directly, her amber eyes holding Elena's with the intensity of someone making decisions that could reshape their understanding of possibility. Ambassador, if your attraction to me is genuine, what would you hope to accomplish by pursuing it? I would hope to learn more about you as a person rather than just as a diplomatic partner, Elena said. I would hope to explore whether the intellectual and emotional connection I sense between us could develop into something meaningful for both of us. Despite the cultural differences and practical complications. Because navigating cultural differences and practical complications together might create something neither of us could achieve alone, Elena replied. Your Majesty, the most rewarding relationships often require us to expand our understanding of what's possible. Queen Zara's scales shifted to the warm goals that Elena was beginning to associate with cautious hope. Ambassador Vasquez, would you be willing to spend time with me in non-diplomatic contexts? Not for negotiation purposes, but simply to explore whether the connection you describe can exist outside professional frameworks. I would be honored to spend time with you in any context you're comfortable with, Elena said, feeling a surge of anticipation at the possibility of learning who Queen Zara was when political responsibilities weren't defining their interaction. Then perhaps, Queen Zara said with a slight smile that seemed more genuine than any expression Elena had seen from her before, we should test your hypothesis about human appreciation for Zarathi individuals who don't meet traditional beauty standards. I look forward to proving that hypothesis correct, Elena replied, understanding that their diplomatic relationship was about to expand into something far more personal and potentially far more meaningful than either of them had initially anticipated. The shift from formal diplomatic interaction to personal connection revealed aspects of Queen Zara's character that Elena found even more appealing than her initial impressions had suggested. Away from the structured environment of trade negotiations, the Queen displayed a curiosity about human culture that went far beyond political necessity, a sense of humor that emerged during unguarded moments, and a vulnerability that made her previous attempts at emotional self-protection all the more poignant. Ambassador, Queen Zara said during one of their evening walks through the palace's private gardens, may I ask you a question that might seem presumptuous? You may ask me anything you'd like, Elena replied, noting how Queen Zara's scales reflected the garden's bioluminescent flowers in patterns that created an ever-changing display of subtle beauty. When you look at me, what do you see? Elena paused in their walk, recognizing that Queen Zara's question carried significance beyond simple curiosity. I see someone whose intelligence sparkles in her eyes when she's processing complex ideas, whose voice carries musical undertones that make even routine conversations feel like sharing secrets, and whose movements display a grace that suggests someone who navigates both physical and social spaces with unconscious artistry. Queen Zara's scales shifted to colors that Elena couldn't interpret but that seemed to indicate surprise mixed with something deeper. You see aesthetic qualities and characteristics that Zarathi culture considers irrelevant to physical attraction. I see aesthetic qualities in the total impression you create, the way your intelligence influences your expressions, how your thoughtfulness affects your posture, the harmony between your physical presence and your personality, Elena explained. Beauty isn't just visual assessment. It's the appeal that emerges from understanding someone as a complete person. That's a remarkably different approach from Zarathi aesthetic theory, Queen Zara observed, settling onto a garden bench while maintaining the careful positioning that Elena was beginning to recognize as habitual self-consciousness about her appearance. Your Majesty, would you be willing to try an experiment? What kind of experiment? Sit naturally, without worrying about how you're positioned, Elena suggested gently. Let me see you as you are when you're not trying to minimize your presence. Queen Zara's scales cycled through patterns that suggested internal debate about vulnerability and self-exposure. Ambassador, Zarathi social conditioning runs quite deep. I'm not certain I remember how to exist without self-conscious awareness of my appearance. Then let me help, Elena said, moving to sit beside Queen Zara on the bench. Close your eyes and focus on something that makes you happy. A memory, an achievement, a future possibility that excites you. Queen Zara followed Elena's suggestion, her expression gradually relaxing as she focused on internal rather than external concerns. As the defensive tension left her posture, Elena observed the transformation that occurred when Queen Zara allowed herself to simply exist without the burden of cultural judgment. What are you thinking about? Elena asked softly. The moment when I realized that becoming queen might allow me to influence Zarathi cultural evolution rather than simply accepting its limitations, Queen Zara said, her voice carrying satisfaction and hope in equal measure. Elena watched Queen Zara's face as she spoke about her political aspirations, noting how passion for her work created an animation that transformed her entire presence. Her scales reflected her emotional state in patterns that seemed to dance across her skin, her voice carried conviction that made her words compelling regardless of their content, and her posture displayed confidence that came from discussing subjects where she knew her capabilities were unquestionable. "Now open your eyes and look at me," Elena said. Queen Zara complied, her amber eyes meeting Elena's with curiosity about what the experiment had demonstrated. "What you just displayed," Elena said, "is the kind of beauty that transcends any culture's standards. When you talk about work that matters to you, you become radiant in ways that have nothing to do with conventional measurements of physical appeal. You're suggesting that passion enhances attractiveness?" "I'm suggesting that authenticity enhances attractiveness," Elena corrected. "When you're focused on ideas that engage your mind rather than worries about your appearance, you become more appealing because you're expressing your genuine self." Queen Zara considered this perspective while her scales shifted through contemplative patterns. "Ambassador, there's something I should tell you about the impact of our conversations on my understanding of possibility." "What would you like to tell me?" "For most of my life, I've approached personal relationships with the assumption that romantic attraction was unavailable to me," Queen Zara said quietly. "I've focused on developing capabilities that could provide value despite my physical inadequacies, and I've accepted that emotional partnership was simply not within my range of life experiences." Elena felt her chest tighten as she recognized the isolation that Queen Zara's cultural conditioning had created. "Your Majesty, has no one ever expressed romantic interest in you?" "Political interest, yes. Strategic alliance interest, certainly. But romantic interest based on genuine attraction?" Queen Zara shook her head. "Ambassador, until our conversations began, I had never experienced someone looking at me as if they found my presence appealing." "And how does that experience feel?" "Confusing," Queen Zara admitted with a slight smile. "Also intriguing, hopeful, and occasionally overwhelming. I find myself questioning assumptions about my own worth that have been fundamental to my self-understanding for decades." Elena reached for Queen Zara's hand, noting the subtle warmth of her skin and the way her scales created texture that was pleasant to touch. "Your Majesty, what would it mean to you if those assumptions were wrong?" "It would mean that I've spent years limiting my possibilities based on incorrect information," Queen Zara said, her voice carrying wonder mixed with regret. "It would mean that cultural standards have prevented me from pursuing experiences that might have enriched my life significantly." "And going forward?" "Going forward, I find myself curious about experiences I've never allowed myself to consider," Queen Zara said, her scales shifting to the warm golds that Elena associated with cautious hope. "Ambassador, I'm curious about what it would feel like to be seen as beautiful by someone whose opinion I value." "You don't have to be curious about that," Elena said softly, moving closer on the garden bench. "You can simply accept that it's already happening." Queen Zara's scales erupted in patterns of brilliant gold and orange that seemed to fill the garden with light as she processed Elena's words. "You're saying that you see me as beautiful." "I'm saying that I see you as remarkable, appealing, and yes, beautiful in ways that your culture's standards couldn't measure even if they wanted to," Elena confirmed. "Your Majesty, beauty is about the total impression someone creates, and the impression you create is extraordinary." Queen Zara was quiet for a long moment, her scales cycling through patterns that seemed to indicate complex emotional processing. When she spoke again, her voice carried a vulnerability that Elena hadn't heard before. "Ambassador, if I were to accept your assessment of my appeal, what would that mean for our relationship?" "It would mean that we could explore the connection between us without the barrier of your assuming I'm being polite rather than honest," Elena said. "It would mean that we could discover whether the intellectual and emotional compatibility we've found can develop into something deeper. Despite the cultural differences and political complications. Because navigating those challenges together might create something more meaningful than either of us could achieve separately," Elena replied, echoing her earlier words but with deeper conviction based on their evolving understanding of each other. Queen Zara turned to face Elena directly, her amber eyes reflecting the garden's bioluminescent light in patterns that seemed to mirror the complexity of her emotional state. "Elena," she said, using the ambassador's first name for the first time, "I want to explore that possibility with you. Not just as a political leader seeking diplomatic advantage, but as someone who has discovered that being seen as beautiful creates feelings I didn't know I was capable of experiencing." What feelings? Elena asked. Hope that romantic partnership might be possible for me, Queen Zara said quietly. Curiosity about what emotional intimacy might feel like. And something that might be the beginning of love for someone who sees beauty where I've only seen inadequacy. Elena felt her heart race as she realized that their diplomatic relationship had evolved into something far more personal and meaningful than either of them had initially imagined possible. Your Majesty, Zara, I want to explore those possibilities with you too, Elena said, recognizing that they were both choosing to pursue something unprecedented that would require courage, patience, and the willingness to redefine their understanding of what beauty and attraction could mean when measured by the heart rather than by cultural convention. As they sat together in the garden, surrounded by alien beauty that human eyes could appreciate despite its foreign origins, both women understood that they were beginning something that would challenge not just their personal assumptions but potentially the cultural frameworks that had shaped their understanding of love, beauty, and the possibilities that emerged when two people chose to see each other clearly rather than through the filters of inherited prejudice. The moment when their relationship transformed from diplomatic courtesy to genuine romantic connection occurred 3 weeks into Elena's extended stay on Zirian Prime, during a private evening when formal negotiations had concluded and they were free to explore the personal bond that had been developing alongside their professional collaboration. Elena, Queen Zara said, her voice carrying the quiet intensity that Elena had learned indicated important conversations, I need to tell you something that may change your perception of our relationship. They were walking through the palace's crystal gardens, where bioluminescent flowers created patterns of light that shifted with the evening air currents. Elena had grown to love these walks for the way they allowed Queen Zara to relax away from the formal demands of royal protocol. What would you like to tell me? Elena asked, noting that Zara's scales were cycling through colors that suggested nervousness mixed with determination. 3 weeks ago, when you first suggested that human aesthetic preferences might include appreciation for Zarathi individuals who don't meet traditional beauty standards, I thought you were offering diplomatic courtesy, Zara said, her steps slowing as they approached the garden's central pavilion. I participated in our personal conversations because I was curious about human perspectives, not because I believed your interest in me was genuine. And now? Now I understand that you've been seeing me as beautiful from the beginning, and that realization has created feelings I don't entirely know how to process, Zara said, settling onto the pavilion's central bench while her scales shifted to the warm golds that Elena associated with emotional vulnerability. Elena joined her on the bench, maintaining the respectful distance that had characterized their evolving relationship while feeling the magnetic pull of proximity to someone whose company had become essential to her happiness. What feelings are you experiencing? Elena asked gently. For the first time in my life, I feel worthy of romantic attention, Zara said quietly. Not because of political alliance or strategic advantage, but because someone finds my presence genuinely appealing. Elena, you've given me the experience of being seen as beautiful, and it's changed how I understand my own possibilities. How has it changed your understanding? I've begun to see myself through your eyes rather than through Zarathi cultural standards, Zara explained, her voice carrying wonder at the transformation. When I look in mirrors now, instead of cataloging inadequacies, I find myself noticing the qualities you've described. The way my scales create light patterns, how my asymmetrical features create dynamic harmony, the complexity in my coloring that becomes apparent with attention. Elena felt her chest warm as she recognized the profound shift that had occurred in Zara's self-perception. And how does that feel? Revolutionary, Zara said with a laugh that carried both joy and amazement. Elena, you've helped me discover that I am capable of being beautiful, not by Zarathi standards, but by standards that matter more because they're based on individual appreciation rather than cultural convention. Zara, you were always beautiful. I've simply been able to see what was already there. But seeing requires someone willing to look without preconceived limitations, Zara pointed out, her scales shifting to brilliant patterns of gold and orange that seemed to make the garden itself brighter. Elena, I've been thinking about what it would mean if we pursued a romantic relationship seriously. What conclusions have you reached? That the cultural and practical complications are less important than the emotional connection we've discovered, Zara said, turning to face Elena directly with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for critical political decisions. Elena, I'm in love with you. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge that would change everything once crossed, and Elena felt her heart race as she processed the magnitude of what Zara had just revealed. I'm in love with you too, Elena replied, recognizing that her feelings had been building toward this declaration since their first conversation, but that hearing Zara's confession had crystallized her own emotions into something clear and unmistakable. Even knowing that loving me means accepting the complications of interspecies relationships, political scrutiny, and the challenges of building something unprecedented? Especially knowing that, Elena said, reaching for Zara's hand with the natural ease that their weeks of growing closeness had made possible. Zara, what we've discovered together is worth navigating any complications that come with it. Zara's scales erupted in patterns of brilliant light that seemed to rival the garden's bioluminescent flowers as she processed Elena's reciprocal declaration. Elena, what would it mean practically if we chose to build a life together? It would mean that you'd have to accept a partner whose aesthetic preferences don't align with Zarathi cultural standards, Elena said with gentle humor. And I'd have to accept a partner who's going to challenge every assumption I've ever made about beauty, attraction, and the ways that love can transcend cultural boundaries. I can accept those terms, Zara said, her voice carrying the joy of someone whose deepest hopes had just been validated by reality. So can I, Elena agreed, understanding that they were both choosing to pursue something that would require ongoing courage and creativity but that promised rewards neither could achieve alone. Elena, there's something else I want to share with you. What's that? Yesterday evening, I made a casual comment to one of my advisors about never being able to be beautiful, Zara said, her voice carrying the weight of someone sharing a pivotal moment. But as I spoke the words, I realized they no longer felt true. For the first time in my life, I couldn't say, I could never be beautiful, with conviction, because I've learned what it feels like to be seen as beautiful by someone whose opinion matters to me. Elena felt tears threaten as she recognized the magnitude of the transformation that had occurred in Zara's self-understanding. And how did that realization feel? Like discovering that I'd been living in a smaller world than necessary, Zara said, her scales shifting to the warm golds that Elena had learned indicated deep contentment. Elena, you've helped me understand that beauty isn't about meeting external standards, it's about the connection between someone who appreciates and someone who allows themselves to be appreciated. Which means you've always had the capacity to be beautiful to the right observer. And you've always had the capacity to see beauty where others might overlook it, Zara replied, leaning closer on the bench until their proximity created the kind of intimate space that made conversations feel like sharing secrets. Zara, what happens next for us? Next, we write new diplomatic protocols for romantic relationships between species representatives, Zara said with the practical approach she applied to all complex challenges. We establish precedents for interspecies partnerships that serve both personal happiness and political cooperation. And we discover whether love can create solutions to problems that conventional diplomacy couldn't address. That sounds like the most worthwhile diplomatic mission I've ever undertaken, Elena said, recognizing that their relationship had evolved beyond personal connection into something that could influence the future of interspecies cooperation. Elena, Zara said, her voice carrying the musical undertones that had first captivated Elena's attention weeks earlier, may I ask you to consider a permanent assignment to Zirian Prime? Not just as a diplomatic representative, but as my partner in both personal and political endeavors. Yes, Elena said without hesitation, understanding that her answer represented a choice to build something unprecedented with someone who had taught her that the most beautiful relationships were the ones that expanded both people's understanding of what was possible. As they sat together in the crystal garden, surrounded by alien beauty that had become familiar and beloved, both women understood that they had discovered something more valuable than successful trade negotiations. They had found proof that love could transcend any culture's definitions of worthiness and create beauty that existed independently of external standards or inherited prejudices. 6 months later, Elena stood beside Queen Zara in the same crystal garden, now serving as both diplomatic liaison and royal consort to a queen who had learned to see her own beauty through eyes unclouded by cultural limitation. Their partnership had not only resulted in groundbreaking trade agreements but had also initiated cultural exchanges that were slowly expanding Zarathi society's understanding of beauty, worth, and the value of perspectives that challenged conventional standards. Any regrets about accepting permanent assignment to an alien world? Zara asked, her scales showing the peaceful patterns that Elena had learned indicated complete contentment. Only the regret that it took a diplomatic mission to bring us together, Elena replied, watching the garden's bioluminescent flowers respond to the evening air currents in patterns that seemed to mirror Zara's emotional expressions. Though I suppose some of the best discoveries happen when we're looking for something else entirely. Elena, Zara said, turning to face her with the smile that had become Elena's favorite sight in any galaxy, do you still find me beautiful? More beautiful every day, Elena replied honestly, understanding that Zara's question reflected not insecurity but wonder at the ongoing reality of being genuinely appreciated. Zara, you're proof that beauty grows more apparent the longer someone looks with eyes unclouded by prejudice. And you're proof that the most valuable perspectives often come from observers who aren't bound by conventional limitations, Zara replied, her scales shifting to the brilliant golds that indicated joy and gratitude. Together, they had transformed a casual comment about never being beautiful into the foundation for a love that proved beauty was not a fixed quality but a dynamic interaction between someone willing to appreciate and someone brave enough to be appreciated, a discovery that would influence not just their personal happiness but the future of interspecies understanding for generations to come.